So what I'm going to talk about is the fact that there is a butterfly indicator for whales, the fact that it's not publicised, that's partly our fault, and just to really talk you through how it's been developed and to give you a bit of background on that. So I'm going to start off sort of using one of the constituent parts as an example, and then moving on to actually what the butterfly indicator for whales is, and to look at some of the results and to some other measures of butterfly abundance that are useful indicators, and perhaps more useful than the actual indicator as it is at the moment. So what I'm going to talk about first of all is one of my favourite topics, which is marsh fritillary monitoring in Wales. At least that's got a W. And I'm just going to just really talk about two aspects of that. The first is about the distribution work that we've been doing, so presence-absence surveys. The second is about the larval web surveillance programme, so the monitoring work that we do. And the bit that I've not got time to cover is the habitat mapping and assessments. So first of all, I just want to clarify what we mean by some of the terms. So when we're talking about populations, we're talking about these discrete aggregations of butterfly records separated by 500 metres of unsuitable habitat from other aggregations. So there's an example there from Østrig lice. And then what we're talking about in terms of metapopulations is how those discrete aggregations, those populations actually interact together. So quite a good year to be talking about this, because there's been certainly a lot of movement of marsh fritillaries because of the really nice weather we had. So the population surveys arose because we just found that when we did the initial assessment in 2011, we'd got 96 populations where there were no recent records, but also because no one had actually visited. So we've started this rolling programme of site visits where we're just aiming to make sure that every site is visited at least once every 5 years. So that leads us to the current situation where we are now. Sorry about the map, it's not great, but hopefully you can just pick out the blue blobs. So we've got 132 populations, of which only 9% are in North Wales. And North Wales is a real concern because many of those populations are very vulnerable, largely due to problems over habitat management. And the rest are in the south and west of the country, with Carmarthenshire having the most populations. And what we've also found is that there is a very large metapopulation that stretches all the way from Cross Hands in the east of Carmarthenshire, all the way along the Heads of the Valleys Road to Hawine and further on as well. And then the next element is the larval web surveillance programme, which was established in 2012 out of the need to actually try and have an idea of producing a Wales index for marsh fritillaries, so we knew how they were doing from year to year. And the first sites we selected for that were basically ones that had already got existing data to enable a time series to be produced. So ones that had already got long-term monitoring that was of good enough quality. And we do larval web counts because basically they're less weather dependent, and it also shows where the marsh fritillaries are actually breeding on a site. And we use standard methods of searching for them in September and August, and this enables us to calculate this All Wales index. So an example here from Welshmoor on the Gower, where the main habitat areas are divided up and sampled using Transx, where you're searching for larval webs 1 metre either side of the transect line, and you're doing that every single year. And then that gives you an index which is made up of webs per hectare. And currently we've got 21 sites across Wales. There's a few more where the data runs are now getting to the stage where they can actually be included. It takes 5 years. So we've got pretty good coverage across all the main areas of Wales. You'll notice that I have not just put continuous marsh fritillary photos, I've thrown in a few of the helpers in terms of site management into these pictures as well. And that basically enables us to come up with a trend which goes back to 1993, which is the start of the reliable data that we've got. And what you can see from the blue line is that marsh artilleries do fluctuate massively from year to year over that time. And also that you can also see that the trend up to 2017 was dipping. I suspect what we'll see that blue line shoot up this year, not so much because of the really big counts on sites that have had populations for quite a lot of years, but for those sites that have, where we've actually counted marsh artillery larval webs this year where they haven't been seen for quite a number of years. So they have a big impact on the trend. And the other thing I just want to point out from this is some of the weaknesses in the particularly for butterflies, but for other invertebrates as well, in terms of the 10-year trends that are very popular in terms of IUCN and things like that, is for species for groups that where they naturally fluctuate by quite a lot from year to year, largely due to weather, though there are other influences there. Is that your start and end date that you choose for those short-term trends, it actually has a massive impact on what the actual short-term trend is. So if you just think of dividing that red line up into 10-year sections, the blue line up into 10-year sections, you'll get quite a different trend in just a 10-year period, which is why these long data runs are really, really important to understand what the actual trend is for invertebrates like butterflies. So just to summarise the marsh artillery elements, so we've got this index now. We've got quite a lot of information at site level and at population level, and definitely at metapopulation level. And that does help us then to prioritise what networks are most important for conservation action, where we need to intervene at site level or at population level because of declines. And this is the irony, we were actually another first for Wales. We're the first country in the UK to actually have a robust index for marsh fertilaries, based on a reasonably robust method, to enable us to report back to the EU for the Article 17 reporting. So for the Habitats Directive. So this will be the first and probably last year that will be used, which is sort of great and sad at the same time. But at least going forward, we have got that index available to let us know how we're doing in a UK context, at least. So moving on to a Wales butterfly indicator. So this is this comes out of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, which is, for those of you that know, is what runs the Butterfly Transex, and that's run by Butterfly Conservation with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. It's funded through the UK agencies, or by the UK agencies through JNCC, and it currently provides an official butterfly indicator for UK, England and Scotland. But the point of mentioning this is it also has produced one for Wales. Forget the word index, that's an error from me, but it should say Wales Butterfly Indicator. So it's based on things like the marsh fertility work that I've mentioned, but there's also other specialist species monitoring and surveillance that occurs, that feeds in through time counts based on the Butterfly Transex and the wider Countryside Butterfly Scheme. And that's from 2014, so that slide's a bit out of date, and you don't need to see the detail, but it just does show that there's reasonably good coverage across Wales of sites that are included in the indicator. And that slide's gone slightly funny, but never mind. And so what I'm going to present is first lot is basically separating out the habitat specialists from the wider countryside or generalist species. So the habitat specialists are those that generally have more precise habitat requirements, might only have one type of larval food plant, and have had historically a more restricted range anyway. And what you can see from that is, well, the trend is actually improving. It's not statistically significant, but it seems to be improving. And I think that's largely down to a lot of the work that's gone on the threatened fertility species. It certainly has halted the decline of those species, such as the marsh fritillary. And then I also wanted to look at Wales versus the UK, and just to put it in a context. So yes, the UK does include the Wales data. But if you look at that, generally, we're actually doing better in Wales than the UK as a whole in terms of conserving our habitat specialists. And this is, remember, is abundance data. And then if you look at generalist species, so that's your wider countryside species, so that's your small tortoise shells, your red admirals, so it includes some of the migrants, your small skippers, those common, much more widespread species. Again, the trend is not significant, but it's showing a sort of slight dip in abundance over the last few years. There is a question over whether the actual data run is long enough for these sorts of index. But again, I just wanted to put it in the context of the UK as a whole. And again, it seems like in Wales, you're more likely to see a generalist butterfly than in the UK as a whole. But what I also wanted to look at, which I think might be more useful from a Wales policy perspective, is occupancy. And because now both CEH and ourselves have developed methods of corralling all that casual data from where people have seen butterflies from a whole range of different sources, and actually can apply really good statistical models to it to actually understand, both from a historical point of view but right through to today, how they are performing. And there are error bars on this, which is the pale colours in the background, which you'll see in a minute are significant. So this is for England, because I couldn't find a UK model, but as it's just over the border, then it's a suitable surrogate. And I just wanted to point out, if you look there, the red line, the habitat specialists, if you just notice, because we'll come on to the Wales one in a minute, if you just notice that really the decline set in since the early 70s and was particularly steep in the 80s up to the 90s. So the habitat specialists were declining in England from the 70s. And in terms of the wider countryside, so the habitat generalists, yes, they dropped down in up to 1990, but have sort of stabilised since then. But again, if you think the start point and where the drought was in 76, you'll see that there was a big impact from the drought in 76, and they never really recovered from that. And then if you look at Wales, so you look at a different picture here. Fair enough, the error margins are much bigger. But if you look at the habitat generalists, they didn't really start to crash in Wales till the 1990s. So the big declines happened a sort of decade later in Wales. Not really unpicked totally why that is. But again, you can see the 76 impact on the wider countryside species. But also, interestingly, on the occupancy, they are showing an upturn in more recent times, but with the caveat about taking short-term trends, looking at short-term trends. So, just in conclusion, I think there's been considerable work over the last decade to improve butterfly monitoring in Wales and actually enable us to come up with what could be some quite useful indicators of the impact of policy changes that are going to be made in the next 5 years. And I think it does provide this invaluable information to inform restoration on the ground, particularly if you know how somebody's doing it at a Wales level and you know how it's doing at your site level. That is a really useful tool. And as I said, I think there's the opportunity there for quite a robust indicator for an invertebrate group to inform the legislation, but also, say, the Nature Recovery Action Plan. And potentially things like, if you're looking at green infrastructure, you could think that which is essentially a broad and shallow biodiversity delivery measure, which you could say that, you would expect that to deliver for those wider countryside, those generalist species. And ecological network restoration should actually deliver for those habitat specialists. But as always, the problem is ongoing financial support to keep these schemes going. So just a big thank you for the many volunteers, and also just really highlight all the partner organisations that help actually provide all this data, the photographers, and for you for listening.